What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Greatness Begins, the PlayStation 1 show where I, Ryan Turford, the man on the moose, tell you all about my 50 favorite PlayStation 1 games of all time, considering how they played today. Of course, today's game I'm very excited to talk about, but before we get into that, if you're listening on podcast services, don't forget to rate us, the PlayStation Drive, on your podcast service of choice, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or, make sure to hit that subscribe button as well. Just like if you're watching on youtube.com/carpoolgaming, where the video version of this is going up as well, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. And ding, 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 ring that bell to be notified whenever we have a live stream or whenever we go live with a new video, because lots of stuff is coming to the channel. It's awesome. And last but not least, of course, heading over to patreon.com/carpoolgaming if you'd like to help us out, if you want to throw a little tip in the old tip jar and get some exclusive content like the Scott Pilgrim stuff, like the Gridlock, which is actually really exciting because we just did a discussion between The Last of Us Part 1 and The Last of Us Part 2. So very centric to this particular podcast. But enough about all that. Let's dive into today's game. Now, I can already see your comments already, folks, wondering, why today's game is so early on in this list. It's a seminal game for the PlayStation 1. It's a game that helped create, Sony's mascot for this platform, for the PlayStation platform during the PlayStation 1 era. And a lot of that just comes down to, modern playability for this particular game, which is Crash Bandicoot. So Crash Bandicoot, originally released on September 9th, 1996. So again, it wasn't a launch title, but it was early enough in the PlayStation launch where, Sony was really looking for a mascot for the platform, and Crash was definitely it, where we saw a ton of ads for Crash, where he was going to Nintendo headquarters and, yelling at him, saying that Mario is kind of old and Crash is here to stay, which, is the stuff that we would have probably seen Sonic and Sega do if, we had new Sonic games that were worth talking about in 1996. So I thought it was an interesting approach to Sony to have this mascot, although this game wasn't, a Sony first party game. Like, it was published by Sony, but also by a different company as well. And we'll get into that a little bit, because this is my excuse, anyways, to talk about a little bit of the history of Naughty Dog, because this is Naughty Dog's very first PlayStation game. But they've been around since 1985. They've been doing stuff forever. Their very first game was called Math Jam, which was released in 1985 on the Apple II, and it was an educational game all about doing math stuff and having all kinds of fun math problems. But in 1989, they released their very first game with EA, as well as they followed this first game with Rings of Power for the Sega Genesis in 1991. Again, like, Naughty Dog was trying to find their footing, trying to see what they were good at. So they came out with 2 RPGs with EA, which is really interesting to hear, especially because, again, you don't really think of Naughty Dog nowadays as like an RPG developer or anything like that. But then after that, Naughty Dog actually worked on a fighting game for the 3DO. So after their relationship with EA, where they had like a really positive relationship with them, company founder Trip Hawkins went to go, found his own company, the 3DO company, and create his own console, the 3DO, which was one of the most expensive video game consoles when it launched anyways, when you adjust for inflation, because that console was like $800 in 1994. And when you do the math now, that's like a $1,000 plus console just by itself. Like, essentially, to buy a 3DO today, if at the price it was originally came out for, you would essentially pay the price of buying a Nintendo Switch, an Xbox Series X, and a PlayStation 5 just together. So it's just a ridiculous thing that happened back then. But a lot of console manufacturers were kind of just popping up out of nowhere. I mean, we also had Panasonic with the CDI, as well as, Amiga trying to get into the game with the Amiga CD32, and just all kinds of weird console manufacturers. But so the reason why Naughty Dog decided to go to 3DO with their next game was, again, their relationship with Trip Hawkins was definitely a big part of it. So they actually signed a publishing deal for multiple games with Universal Interactive Studios. Basically, Universal was trying to get into the game publishing game. They'd been around for a while, like all the way into the 80s in being involved with publishing under MCA. But what ended up happening with that was they had to split off the MCA division into 2 different companies after purchasing LJN. And I mean, there was a whole history that goes into that. So that's maybe an episode of like Pit Stop Gaming history down the road. But I think the history of Universal Interactive Studios is really interesting and cool. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to have two games to announce when they announced that the company was formed in 1994. That included The Way of the Warrior, which was the Naughty Dog fighting game that I was hinting at. They also developed a Jurassic Park game for 3DO, and oh my god, that game is so bad. Oh man, it's such a bad game. But Way of the Warrior was an okay fighting game, but it was very much trying to be like a Mortal Kombat clone at the time, where you had digitized, real life actors in there, and you had like fatalities, and it was very violent. Like it was, again, very much trying to chase the Mortal Kombat thing. It was not, ashamed of that, because lots of games were doing it at that time, especially if you were a fighting game that was coming out in the mid 90s. You were probably chasing Mortal Kombat in some way or another. So that was what Way of the Warrior was. But this publishing deal actually allowed Naughty Dog to work inside Universal City, which is a Los Angeles facility, which is where Universal Studios Hollywood, the theme park is, but also Universal Studios, the company is totally based in that same park. And it's just this giant plot of land in LA, where all of the Universal properties come to work. And that was kind of their big visionary plan, after hiring vice president at the time, Mark Cerny, who we now know, of course, as, the visionary behind the PlayStation 4 and a key part of, Sony's hardware team. But his leadership at Universal really brought in a bunch of other talent. This was also the same deal that was offered to Insomniac Games to help bring Spyro over there, because Spyro was also a Universal Interactive thing, which is the reason why when, Spyro and Crash were sold, they were both sold to Activision at the time, because they were both under Universal, and Universal was getting out of the game at that time, which is why they actually ended up selling Crash and Spyro. So it's a really interesting situation where this was brought to the PlayStation, because Universal Sony was talking to different developers out there, trying to get people on board with the PlayStation 1, and it turns out that Mark Cerny saw a lot of promise in this console and decided to sway both Naughty Dog and Insomniac to develop their games for the PlayStation 1. So I wanted to take this little pit stop in the history of Naughty Dog. Of course, again, I would love to do maybe like a larger history of Naughty Dog one day. But for now, that's enough history for one day. Let's talk about Crash, though, because, again, I think Crash Bandicoot, the original game, is a really interesting platformer, but it definitely has its problems. And the problems that it had at the time are definitely problems that are just heightened nowadays when we revisit games a lot of times. Because a lot of what you're doing in this game, for example, it's a 3D platformer, just like a lot of other 3D platformers. We're trying to explore, playing games in 3D at the time. Mario 64 had been out when this came out. So it was really interesting to kind of look back on a game like this. But Crash Bandicoot, the original, even though it's in 3D, it plays a lot like a 2D game where you're really just running on like a singular axis, and then sometimes you're moving back and forth. But for the most part, you don't really have like free movement for the most part or anything like that. Except for in certain sections. But also there's a lot of, 2D side, like horizontal sections where you're trying to do some platforming up a wall or something like that. So it almost feels like a nice in-between between a 3D platformer and a 2D platformer, and they kind of like mix things up together. But Crash Bandicoot as a character, he's just really funny and humorous. But in this original version, I just don't feel like they explore his character enough. We definitely see that more in the sequels, which, again, even though we're just talking about Crash 1 now, we will be talking about the Crash sequels at some point on this list. So you could better believe this is not the last time we talk about Crash. But the problems that this game kind of has, in the lens of modern day when we're kind of looking back on this game, is the fact that you're running towards the camera a lot of the time, or you just can't see behind you. Like you don't have enough, like the camera's too close to Crash a lot of times. And it just makes for some really difficult platforming in a way that it shouldn't be difficult. Like it feels more frustrating than fair. Like a game like Ninja Gaiden is an example I bring up all the time on the NES, where even though the platforming in that game is very unforgiving, it feels fair. Like if you die, it feels like it's your fault. Whereas if sometimes you'll die in Crash Bandicoot, and it just feels like you failed because the camera was in the wrong position, or it was tougher to see that obstacle coming over there. So it almost feels unfair or a little bit cheap sometimes with its deaths. So that's why I really like Crash Bandicoot, the original. I think it was a seminal game for the PlayStation 1. It brought a lot of people onto the platform, especially kids who were growing up and maybe got, the PlayStation 1 for Christmas. This was a game that, I saw whenever I went over to a friend's place and they had a PlayStation 1. This was like the default game that most, 10-year-olds, which is kind of the era that I was at when this console came out. Like that, when I would see them at their house, I'm like, okay, they've got Crash. Like it makes sense. It almost was like the PlayStation starter pack is to get a PlayStation 1 console and get Crash along with it. So yeah, it makes sense as to why, Crash was so ubiquitous and was really kind of instrumental in, people growing up with games in particular, or just getting into games in general. Like I know a lot of people that one of their first games of all time that they ever played was Crash Bandicoot, because for the reasons I just discussed. So it was definitely a key game when it came to that. And actually playing the modern remake in the Insane trilogy, I think is actually a much better way to revisit this game, which is also part of the reason why it's not higher on this list either, is because even though it's still fine on the PlayStation 1, it's not like there's definitely better ways to play it. And I do think the Insane Trilogy version is better, especially because it can be a little more forgiving, but also I think they cleaned up some of the little problems that the original game had with some of the cheap stuff. There's still definitely cheap deaths in it, but it's not like as bad, I think, as the original version, combined with the fact that I love just the new visual style for the Crash remake. So I definitely think it's a much better way to play that game now. And plus, if you ever want to revisit Crash, like there's a number of ways to do that. You can play it there, or it's on the PlayStation Vita because it is on the PlayStation Store, or likewise, it's on the PlayStation 3 if you still got one of those kicking around. But I think the original version of Crash Bandicoot is still a monumentally important game as far as 3D platformers are concerned, and it's definitely one of the better ones from this era, from the early 3D era, because we saw some real bad ones come out around this time, like Bubsy 3D and some other stuff. So I think Crash Bandicoot in particular is a really important game, and just one that definitely deserves to be played if you've never played it before. Although I remember when the Insane Trilogy came out and people were describing Crash 1 as being like the Dark Souls of Crash games. So just be prepared for a little bit of a difficulty spike, because it can definitely be really difficult. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Greatness Begins. You know, you can on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can also find us on Twitter at Carpool Gaming, on YouTube at youtube.com/Carpool Gaming, on Patreon at patreon.com/Carpool Gaming, on podcast services around the globe. So for Greatness Begins, I'm Ryan Turford, and we're out.